Hello, and welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Church's Fall Adult Education Series. My name is Brent Hall, and I serve as the co-chair of the Adult Education Council at Westminster. Our speaker for this two-part series is Dr. Michael Chen. Dr. Chen is an assistant professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is a graduate of Pacific Lutheran University and holds an MA in Old Testament from Luther Seminary and a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Emory University. He is a sought-after speaker, author, retreat leader, and host of the Gospel Beautiful podcast, which interviews guests about the challenging task of preaching the gospel in the 21st century. Michael will be a familiar face to many Westminster members, having taught adult education classes here previously and also hosting the men's fall retreat several years ago. This is a two-part series. The first part is a pre-recorded presentation, with the second part being a live, moderated Q&A Zoom session the following week. We hope everyone who has the chance to view this presentation before September 27th will have the opportunity to join us at 9:15 Central Daylight Time on September 27th for the live Q&A session with Dr. Chen. Now please welcome Dr. Chen for his presentation, The Biblical Prophets and Their War Against Denial.
Greetings to all of my friends at Westminster Presbyterian Church. This is Dr. Michael Chen. It is great to be with you. Not ideal, of course, that we have to do this initial course as a pre-recorded teaching time. Really am sorry about that. But our second week together, next week, we will actually do live over Zoom. And there are going to be opportunities for you to ask questions and to interact and all of that stuff. So don't be too dismayed. I feel like the best. I love teaching at your church, by the way, and I feel like the best sessions have always been one where there's just tons of questions and engagement. And you all are such a great group to teach with and among. And so I am just really looking forward to this session right now, and then also our live interactive session in the next week. But for now, we're going to jump into the material. This is going to be a course on Jeremiah. Let me get the presentation started here. A course that focuses on the prophet Jeremiah, and we're calling it Denying Disaster, Jeremiah's War Against Denial. Now, let me tell you a bit about the origins of how we kind of came up with this title and with this topic. I don't think it's going too far afield to say that many of the challenges that we're facing right now, whether they have to do with COVID or with environmental issues or with race issues or other issues related to inequality, so many of them have been permitted to grow into the monsters that they are, in large part because we have many segments of our society have lived in denial. And part of that denial is the silencing of prophets and the silencing of voices that will call our attention to disasters that we are making ourselves. These are not the devastating issues that I just named a few minutes ago. These are monsters of our own making. And as I said, they have been largely fed, or they have been partially fed, by our own denial of their existence, or our wish simply to kind of hide our head under the sand. And so what I wanted to do, given the power that denial has in our current moment, or that it has had over decades and even centuries, I thought it would be interesting for us to think about the topic of denial, but at a different point in history. In fact, one that's very, very far removed. You know, it's often the case that we're in our current moment. It's hard to sometimes feel the full impact of our current moment, or to kind of interpret it fully, because we're sort of living in it, right? Like it's all around us. It's like a fish trying to interpret the water it lives in, or to study the water that it lives in. Sometimes we are required, or we need to go to a different crisis in order to more fully understand our own. This is one of the reasons why I love science fiction so much, and really just fiction in general, is because, especially with science fiction, there is this opportunity to reflect your own kind of social situation, but in a way that feels so strange, literally so alien, that it's a little, that even that its alienness actually allows you to see more clearly your own situation. So we're going to do a little bit of that, but by looking in particular at the time of Jeremiah. Now, let me say a couple things just about Jeremiah the person, also about Jeremiah the book, before we actually dig into the texts. Jeremiah is a prophet. And his life, the life of the historical Jeremiah, straddles one of the most significant events in the history of ancient Israel in the 6th century, the Babylonian exile. Now, what do we mean? This is kind of shorthand. I'm sure some of you have heard this terminology, Babylonian exile, but what is actually meant by this terminology? At the time that Jeremiah was alive, the dominant imperial power was based in Mesopotamia, right? All the great empires of the Near East are riverine empires. So we have the Assyrians in northern Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates as part of that. Similarly with the Babylonians, also able to tap into the Tigris and Euphrates, but to the south. And then, of course, the other great river civilization is the Egyptian civilization. And so kind of in the first millennium, at least, these two riverine centers of power in many ways competed over the ancient Near East, and especially over resources and things like tribute and whatnot. And because ancient Israel was such a small place, such a small kind of a nation, it was often caught in the middle of elephants, as it were, right, as they sort of vied for power with one another. In the case of the 6th century, while Jeremiah was alive, the dominant power was the Babylonian Empire. It had, along with the Medes, had overthrown the Assyrians earlier on. And so that's sort of, I'm going to say a couple more things about chronology, but that's generally, when I talk about the Babylonian exile, what I'm talking about is a number of military actions directed against ancient Judah, the capital of which is Jerusalem, that ultimately resulted in the exile of many Jews from Judah and from Jerusalem, and they were then exiled to Babylon. In general, the people who were exiled were kind of what we might consider today to be elites, sort of the cream of the crop, as it were, which left the poor of the land. The poor of the land were left to live in Judah. But so when we talk about the Babylonian exile, we're talking about this point in time when Jews were forcibly removed from their homeland and forced to live in Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule. So you could think of stories like the book of Daniel, who, according to the book of Daniel, he is one of these Babylonian exiles that was taken during this period of time. Excuse me. Ezekiel is also in exile, and there are many others that could be named. Now, you'll notice earlier I mentioned that Jeremiah straddles this event. So he lives before it, he lives through it, and he lives after it. Okay? That's very, very important that Jeremiah's life overlaps with these horrific events, and they were truly horrific. Before these events occurred, and even during, Jeremiah was prophesying, he was preaching and warning about these events, and in fact offering a kind of ways, different alternative paths that in some cases may have actually saved them from the worst of this violence. But Jeremiah is living throughout it, and he warns about this event. He accuses Israel's leaders of basically making their own bed, of bringing this destruction down upon themselves because of their foolish action. And he continues this ministry after the fact. So after Jerusalem is destroyed, after the temple is destroyed, after the royal the king, after the king is deposed from the throne, Jeremiah continues to minister to the people of God. And his kind of persistent prophetic presence was actually one clear way in which God demonstrated commitment to God's people, that even though they were in exile, even though they were experiencing, right, the consequences of their own actions and foolishness and sin, Jeremiah continued to minister to them. And this was an ongoing kind of sign that God was still with God's people, even though even though they were in the midst of judgment, experiencing the consequences of their own sins. This is just a excuse me. This is just a general kind of chronology of ancient Israel's history. I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to kind of situate the events that we're going to be talking about in this broader history. So we'll talk about the bookends here. Around 1200 to 1000 BCE, we have the emergence of a distinct group of Semitic language-speaking people that the Bible refers to as Israel. So around this time, around 1000 to 924, we have the emergence of the monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. So these are the first kings of Israel, right? And the only kings, in fact, who are over the entirety of Israel. Before that, the Bible records events like the books of Joshua and Judges, the book of Exodus, where Israel is freed from Egypt. Much of the history there is not exactly known. There are some serious questions to be asked about whether the biblical stories really reflect what happened in history. The first really concrete reference to the people of Israel as a people occurs in 1209, and that's why the date 1200 is so important, because that seems to be a distinctive point at which Israel emerges on the scene as a distinct Semitic language-speaking people. The name Israel actually appears on an Egyptian stela, often called the Stela of Mer-Empatah. We're not going to talk anymore about that. Just don't have any time. And so we have the emergence of the monarchic period here around 1000. Hundreds and hundreds of years go by. In 597 to 586, the highlighted part right here, this is our period. So a lot's happened between now and then. The northern and southern kingdoms have split off. By this time, the northern kingdom itself has actually fallen and been utterly destroyed. What happened to those quote-unquote lost tribes is really still unknown. Those northern tribes that were deported by the Assyrians, we have no idea what happened to them, but that's one of the major events between the emergence of the monarchy and the Babylonian exile. So this is really where we are. A lot of history here prior. A lot of this is covered in books like 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and Chronicles. But the Babylonian exile here really marks the end of the monarchic period as it's understood in books like Kings. So the Babylonians lay siege against Jerusalem, and this eventually results in its destruction, and then also resulting the many Jews, especially elite Jews, are deported and exiled to Babylon. Now, there's a lot of other stuff, as you can tell, that happens after the exile, a lot of very, very important things, including the restoration of the temple. But we're not going to get into all that right now. I just want you to have a general sense of, when we look at kind of Israel's history beginning in 1200 and then going all the way up to the 2nd century, where roughly is Jeremiah situated? And Jeremiah's life falls right generally in this category, though he lives before and after that. Okay, one other thing. There are really 3 key moments of both death and resurrection in Israel's life. I'm using those terms, kind of death and resurrection, a little bit metaphorically. There are 3 kind of key and even crisis moments that occur in Israel's history that are deeply impactful. They impacted the Bible deeply, and around the same time there were also prophets at work. So these 3 key moments include the end of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. Remember, the 2 kingdoms have split. The southern kingdom is centered in Jerusalem and Judah, and then the northern kingdom here, they end up being destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. This is a serious crisis moment. It's a moment of death, and quite appropriately, there are prophets who are declaring this at the time. Now, the second is the end of the southern kingdom, or we could say the exile of Jews during the Babylonian exile. That's what we're going to be focusing on. This is also a moment of profound death. Let me try and describe why I call it a moment of death, and let me try and do that in a way that will be really, hopefully, straightforward. This is a significant event, the Babylonian exile, the end of the southern kingdom, for a couple reasons. Firstly, the temple is destroyed, which fundamentally changes or forces Jews of the time to rethink how they're going to do worship when the central apparatus for worship, namely the altar and the temple complex, is no longer existing. It no longer exists. So that's one thing, is that the temple no longer exists. It's been destroyed. Secondly, the monarchy is no longer in existence. Now you might say, well, who cares? They don't have a king. Why is this such a big deal? This is a big deal because, at least according to 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic monarchy, the monarchy of David's line, right, which sat on the throne in Jerusalem, was a very special monarchy. In fact, if you were to look back at 2 Samuel 7, you'll find a prophecy there that says that God will always make sure that there's always a son on the throne from the line of David. Of course, Christian kind of messianic theology emerges out of this kind of thinking too. But this was a serious crisis. God had made a promise that there would always be a son of David on the throne. Suddenly, in this period during the Babylonian exile, there is no son of David on the throne. So this isn't just a political problem. This is also a theological problem and a social problem. Theological in the sense that God had presumably made this promise to Israel, and suddenly God was that promise was not being manifest. You can see why this is. You can see the pain that this instance caused if you read Psalms like Psalm 89. Psalm 89 specifically reflects on God's apparent lack of willingness to keep God's promise about the Davidic line. So it's deeply, deeply painful. And the third moment of crisis, which is really actually a moment of life, is the return from exile from Mesopotamia back to the land of Canaan. We're not really going to be talking about that. But my point in showing you all of these three key moments of both death and resurrection is to say that in each of these moments, there were prophets at work, speaking important words of God to the people, but their words were often met with denial and disregard. This is an interesting fact about the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. In most cases, they fail. In most cases, they fail. And what do I mean by fail? They fail to convince their modern-day audiences that there is something wrong. They fail to convince, especially the rulers, to repent. They so often fail to convince those who are in power to use their power in ways that are just. It is very rare, relatively rare, for the Hebrew prophets to succeed. For instance, the one kind of humorous exception here, a really astronomically kind of humorous exception, is Jonah, right? Jonah, the reluctant prophet. And Jonah, of course, is very successful in convincing the Ninevites, right, to repent of their sin. The book of Jonah is meant to be humorous, and that's part of the humor, is that it's humorous that the only people that listen to this prophet, right, are these evil Ninevites, right, who inhabit the capital of an empire that had done all kinds of damage to Judah. So anyways, in each of these moments, there were prophets at work. In most cases, they failed to convince their audiences and encourage them to repent, and they were often met with denial and disregard. So now we get to the book of Jeremiah. Over the next couple weeks, we're going to be studying a couple of texts, and we're going to dig really deep into them. And these texts are all instances in which the prophet was trying to convince his people that disaster was on the way, that they needed to take action in order to try and avert it, or at least to be aware of it. But in all of these cases, Jeremiah basically fails to bring about any significant change. And that's sort of the story of Jeremiah, is that he has many important words to say. But unfortunately, the audience of his time, the people of his time, lived in a profound amount of denial. And we're actually going to study that denial right now as we read Jeremiah 7. So if you want to get out your own Bible, you can do that. That's fine. This is Jeremiah 7, 1 through 19. I will be reading from the NRSV. It's fine if you have a different translation. All that matters is that you're reading the Bible. You can be reading from the King James. It really doesn't matter. Just try to follow along. Of course, the translation will be a little bit different if you aren't using the NRSV, but not so much so that you won't be able to follow. This is sometimes called Jeremiah's temple sermon, one of his temple sermons. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord: stand in the gate of the Lord's house, the gate of the temple, and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter these gates to worship the Lord. So it's like, right, just think about it. This prophet guy shows up at the front door of the church, and that's what he's doing, right? He's going to give a sermon, not within the temple, but right at its gates, presumably so that he has a good audience and a large number of people that are going to hear him. So that's where he is. He's supposed to stand in the gate of the Lord's house. Verse 3, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. I'm going to return to what that means in just a few minutes, but let's just kind of walk through the text a little bit, and then we'll return and comment on some details. But the first thing to notice, right, is that the prophet has something to say to them about changing their life, about changing their ways, right, and their doings, and to let me, God, dwell in this place. So that's part of it, is that the Jeremiah is asking for a change, for their lives somehow to change. And notice this whole bit about letting me dwell with you. Whatever they are doing is somehow making it difficult for God to dwell with them. That is an important point. In other words, whatever their kind of destructive ways are, God is not interested in dwelling in the midst there. They're somehow repulsive to God's presence. Their ways, whatever they're doing, is somehow repulsive to God's presence. Now, the third point here is this injunction: do not trust in these deceptive words. So, the people in Jeremiah's time have a couple problems. One, they need to change something because their behavior, their actions, the way that they go about the world is repulsive to God's presence. God doesn't want to be near those kind of people. And the next problem, though, is that they somehow are deceived. Something is keeping them from acting in the way that they should, from doing what God commands them. Something, they are trusting in words that they should not be trusting in. They're allowing their lives to be shaped by words that are not of God. Okay? So let's keep moving to verse 5. If you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly to one another, here we're getting more details about what they're doing wrong, right? They're not acting justly. If you truly act justly to one another, if you do not oppress the alien, that's like somebody from a different country or a different land that is coming to sojourn in your midst and seek refuge and whatnot. So when they say, we're not talking about like little green men. Do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place. And if you do not go after other gods, to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave you of old to your ancestors forever and ever. So what are the ways that need amending? Firstly, they are not acting justly toward one another. We don't get a ton of details, but a couple. They are oppressing the alien, again, somebody from another land who's living in Israel. That's perfectly legal. Israel had open laws toward an open kind of orientation toward those who were aliens, because they themselves, right, were once aliens in Egypt, and they experienced brutal treatment there, at least during the time of Moses. So don't oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow. These three categories, alien, orphan, and widow, these are kind of the three primary categories of vulnerability. So if you were to say to an ancient Israelite in the past and say, well, we say marginalized and we mean this. What do you mean when you talk about, who are the vulnerable in your society? And it's the alien, the one who's wandering in a foreign land, the orphan, right? Because they don't have the protection of a father's house or of a household there to provide for them. And similarly with the widow, right? I mean, keep in mind, this is a patriarchal society. And so for a widow not to have a husband puts her into a vulnerable situation. And then they're told, not to shed innocent blood in this place, meaning in this temple. And then they're not to go after other gods. So we have kind of a laundry list here of things that Jeremiah is complaining about. And now let's go to verse 8. Here you are, here in this temple, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, a lot of Ten Commandments stuff here, right? Making offerings to Baal and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, we are safe, only to go on doing these abominations? Okay, there's a lot in this passage. So here God is really, God through Jeremiah is really going after them. And Jeremiah is also now filling out what does he mean by deceptive words. So there are some words that they are trusting and believing that are causing a problem with God. And this is the heart of the deception. It is okay for them to steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods, and then come stand in the house of the Lord and assume that they are safe. God is not going to have any of that. Right? God is not going to tolerate that these people who are in a more privileged position are going to go and do harm to others, act unfaithfully toward God, unfaithfully toward their neighbor, and then come back into God's house and think that they are not at risk. So that's the point of denial, right? Well, we can just go live, any way we want, just, any way that will allow us to benefit, to, extract whatever we need from others, take advantage of others, worship whatever God we want, and then assume that we are going to be safe. Jeremiah says, no way, right? No way is God going to tolerate that kind of hypocrisy. And then he goes on in verse 11. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You recognize that language of den of robbers, right? Jesus draws on this in the Gospels. I too am watching, says the Lord. So here's the other theological point. Their denial, their belief that they are safe, part of that belief is that they just say, God isn't watching. God doesn't see what I do. If nobody sees it, it's like the old philosophical adage that, if the tree falls in a forest, does it actually make a noise? This would be like, if I commit sin and nobody sees it, does it actually happen? The answer, according to the Bible, is yes, it happens, because the Lord is always watching, right? But that's part of what their denial, what their trust in deceptive words has led them to believe, is that God does not see. That God does not see the entirety of their life. And so part of the kind of crust of denial that Jeremiah needs to punch through is this belief that they can sin and harm their neighbor and then come back and worship God without any risk to themselves. Jeremiah is saying, every time you do harm to your neighbor, you are inviting death to the door. You are inviting the wolf to come and play among the sheep. Now, let's go on to verse 12. Go now to my place that was in Shiloh. This was another worship spot where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. So Jeremiah is pointing here to an historical example of where another worship site, Shiloh, was destroyed as a result of the wickedness of God's people. So God's saying, hey, look, just because this place here in Jerusalem, this temple is Jerusalem, is where you're supposed to worship me, doesn't mean that you can go be hypocritical and then come back and live here safely, right? That's part of their denial, is that they are denying that they will actually experience the consequences of their own sin. And this is often what you'll hear, sometimes when politicians get caught, or famous people, not just politicians, but when famous people get caught for doing wrong, often a part of their apology is, I felt invincible. I don't know why, I felt like there were not going to be any consequences for the wrongdoing that I did. And that's part of what Jeremiah is trying to do here, is say, somehow you all have convinced yourself that you can sin in secret and never see the consequences of that. And Jeremiah is saying that is nonsense. The denial is the denial of sin, and the denial of the way that you are hurting the neighbor is actually building up into a tidal wave, right? There are going to be consequences for this denial. Okay, let's see. Okay, 13. And now, because you have done all these things, says the Lord, and when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen, and when I called you, you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name, meaning the temple in Jerusalem, in which you trust, and to the place that I gave to you and to your ancestors, just what I did to Shiloh. So the same thing that happened to this other sanctuary, this other place of worship, that is going to happen to Jerusalem. I will cast you out of my sight, just as I cast out all your kinsfolk, all the offspring of Ephraim. This reference here to Ephraim, the offspring of Ephraim, that is another name for the northern kingdom. So keep in mind that the northern kingdom was destroyed, was brought to ruin, not too far in the distant past to this current moment in 589. It happens in 722. Now we're in, roughly between the years of 589 and 586. And God is saying the same thing that happened to the northern kingdom can happen to you too, even though this is the place where my temple is. Don't think that just because this is a sacred place, that it is a place where that cannot experience the consequences of unjust behavior. As for you, do not pray for this people. This is God now speaking to Jeremiah. Do not raise a cry or prayer on their behalf, and do not intercede with me, for I will not hear you. Isn't that this? I think whenever I read this verse, it always strikes me as one of the most terrifying comments in the Bible. One of the most terrifying statements of divine judgment, that God will not hear prayer. That is what God is saying. Jeremiah, don't even pray for these people. I will not hear you. Heaven will be silent. From my perspective, that is a terrifying thing. Verse 17, do you not see what they are doing in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. Is it I whom they provoke, says the Lord? Is it not themselves to their own hurt, right? So God is saying, look, they are bringing down these things upon themselves. Okay, so we walked through the whole text, Jeremiah 7, 1 through 19, Jeremiah's temple sermon. Now I want to go back to verse 4 here. Excuse me, I just need a drink. I want to go back here to verse 4. These deceptive words. Now, of course, we get it again in verse 8, right? This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. What is going on here? There was, at the time that Jeremiah was alive, a theology at work, a theology, seemingly popular theology, that the God of Jerusalem would always protect God's special city, that Jerusalem was the God's kind of heavenly or earthly, I should say, God's earthly seat of government. Zion, Jerusalem, the temple of God, right, where David and his descendants ruled. This was God's special city. There are biblical texts that say as much. Let's look at a couple of them. This is Psalm 46, one of my favorite Psalms. I love Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with tumult. Selah. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The city of God is Jerusalem, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of its city. The city, it shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. So this is what we call a Zion psalm. That's what biblical scholars call this. It's a psalm about the city of God and how it is impenetrable. Why? Because it is God's city, right? The key of this is found here in verse 5. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. Part of Jeremiah's message is to say that these promises that God will protect, they're not just unconditional promises that God's just going to do it irrespective of how the people act toward one another. Part of what Jeremiah is going to do is say, hey, God will protect this city, but not when you all disgrace God's name by mistreating one another, by extorting one another, while you have blood on your hands. God is not going to protect it. And so in some ways, Jeremiah is at war with one form of this theology. And it's important to note that this is a theology that is deeply biblical, right? There are even historical events, I'll tell you about one in a minute, that support this theology. For example, in 701 BC, just over 100 years prior to this, an Assyrian king named Sennacherib surrounded the city with his armies. And through his spokesperson, one of his generals, threatened the city of Jerusalem, threatened to destroy it like he had destroyed so many other cities. At that time in 701, according to Isaiah 36 through 37, God protected the city miraculously. This is like an historical example of the theology that Psalm 46 is naming. Jeremiah, however, is saying, you think that theology applies irrespective of how you treat your neighbor? And Jeremiah says no. And he insists that when they simply trust in words like Psalm 46, and at the same time crush the poor, right? Oppress their neighbor, do wrong to their neighbor, that God is not going to overlook that. But that to do those things is to invite the consequences of sin. They are living in denial, and part of the problem that Jeremiah has, and here's one of the key things I want you all to take away, is that their theology helps legitimate the denial. Their theology, even though it's a distorted one, it is theology that allows them to act in a way that the denial can go on. So that's an interesting insight, and one that we're going to return to in just a few minutes. I want to show you one other psalm here. Psalm 48, just two more. Two later. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain in Jerusalem, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king, meaning God. With its citadels, God has shown himself a sure defense. Then the kings assembled. They came on together. As soon as they saw it, they were astounded. They were in panic. They took to flight. Trembling took hold of them there, pains as of a woman in labor, as when an east wind shatters the ships of Tarshish. As we heard, so have we seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, which God establishes forever. So again, you have this notion that this is the city of God, that God establishes forever. It is the city of the great king. God himself is the defense of this city. How could it ever be overthrown? So this is the kind of theology that is in fact energizing the denial and bolstering the denial of God's people. This theology kind of comes in the following shorthand. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. And what do those deceptive words mean? That they can steal, murder, commit, etc., and then come and stand before me in this house and say, we are safe. Jeremiah is saying, you cannot invite sin to the door and not expect death to come with it. That's the other way of saying it. You cannot invite sin into your house. You cannot invite sin to the door and not expect death to come with it. They always come together. And that is what is being denied by Jeremiah's audience. And I would argue, to kind of bring it into the modern day, so many of the challenges that we are facing right now around COVID and racism and all kinds of oppressive forms of inequality, many of these have been legitimated. Let me actually back up and say, many of these have been worsened because of societal denial, because we have not been able to see these things for the evil that they are. What's more, it would be interesting to ask, is there any way in which our theology enables the denial? Is there any way in which our theology makes it easier for us to overlook the suffering of our neighbors? Is there any way in which our theology makes the denial a more appealing option? Those are questions that I can't answer for you, personally, or even as a congregation. But these are questions that I want us to live with. I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then we're kind of coming, into a conclusion here in a minute. But some key questions. How is denial at work in your life? How is it at work in this congregation? And what about other communities or civic societies to which you belong? A lot of times, because denial is a much more, comfortable option than not, it's sometimes difficult for us to see as insiders within our communities how denial might be at work. Sometimes we can. That's what prophets do, is that they help us see our denial, how denial might be at work, or just how destructive patterns might be at work. Prophets are often people, prophetic voices, often come from people who have keen insights into the deep fractures within our communities. It's wise as congregations to listen to those voices and try and discern who those voices might be, where they might be coming from, etc. So how is denial at work in your life? How is it at work in the congregation? What about other communities to which you belong? In many ways, crises like COVID and others have a way of revealing how denial and other destructive forces are actually at work. They sort of make those fractures, they put them into stronger contrast. And so while we would never want to celebrate crisis, right? We should see crisis. It's a chance for us to kind of look around and take stock and say, what problems were extant before, but are now being accentuated? How can we see our challenges more clearly because we're living through a moment of crisis? And how is denial at work to kind of prevent us from engaging those problems and crises in a more direct way? Down to the second point, how does denial impact your family? What about your marriage? What about your relationship with parents or children or other, loved ones or members of your family? How are we trying to keep our heads stuck in the sand? How are we, like Jeremiah's own audience, acting in ways that are destructive to others and thinking that there will be no consequences for that? Thirdly, are there any ways in which denial of a problem or crisis is having an impact on our vulnerable neighbors? Right? That's again a question that you all as a congregation can only ask for yourselves, but are there vulnerable neighbors that you all might have who might be harmed by the way that the forces of denial might be at work in your congregation? Again, I can't answer that for you. Fourthly, what is the Spirit urging us to act upon at this moment? And how are the forces of denial preventing us from acting in ways that will benefit our community and our neighbors? Again, a discernment question. I can't answer that for you. And then finally, last question. Are there any Jeremiahs in your midst whom you, or we, right, or you all as a congregation, we as a society are ignoring? I would say that there are, but the problem is that there have been so many Jeremiahs. Some of them, the more prominent ones, have even been killed and silenced, right? One thinks especially of people like MLK, but he's only the most prominent Jeremiah, right? There are many, the spirit of Jeremiah is present in so many different voices, and oftentimes the people that see the forces of denial most clearly are the ones who are maybe not as embedded or committed or dependent upon the kinds of patterns of thinking that are normal to our own communities. And so that's why this is one of the most important reasons why diversity is an important commitment. Because part of diversity is getting into community with people who will challenge your worldview. And if you don't have those kinds of companions, then you're keeping the wrong company, right? People who will actually push hard against your worldview, either directly, or just by the way that they live, that will disrupt and disturb your worldview or your theology. So where are those Jeremiahs? Might have to look hard for them. On the other hand, they may be just sitting next to you in church when we actually, are doing that in a face-to-face kind of way. Well, friends, I'm grateful to be able to start this journey with you this week. I'm looking forward to next week's session when we will. The way it's going to work next week is I'm going to do a shorter teaching, maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. I'm then going to respond to some questions that people have emailed me, and I actually want to invite you to email me questions that you might have. Let me actually put my email address in here. If you have any questions that you want me to address related to this topic, and I do ask that you try and keep it kind of related to our current topic just so that, so we don't get too far afield, send those to mchan002@luthersem.edu. Send me some questions. I'll take those up next week. Plus, after I take up these questions, I will have an open Q&A time on Zoom where you will be able to submit questions kind of in a live way. We'll inform you next week what that's going to look like, is sort of the technical sides of that. But you're going to have a chance to ask questions, pose questions, or make comments. So we'll do that. And that will be the end of our session. But we'll again be focusing on this whole matter of denying disaster, and we'll be grounding it, of course, in the text of Jeremiah. Now, I want to do a little bit of self-promotion here. Would love to kind of stay connected with all of you. You can find me on Facebook. Would love to have you friend me there. That would be great. I also run a podcast. It's a long-form interview-based podcast called Gospel Beautiful. Just go to Google, type in these 3 words, Gospel Beautiful Podcast, and it will pop up. Or what you can do is go to your podcatcher. If you use like an iPhone, you just go to the podcast app, or similarly with Android, any of the major kind of podcast hosting places like iHeart or the iTunes and Apple or Spotify. You will be able to find Gospel Beautiful. Just type in those 3 words. Finally, if you're interested in doing some reading, this is actually not a super long book. It's also not very expensive. Exploring the Bible is a book that I co-authored with Eric Barreto. It's a kind of theological introduction to the Bible. It was really written originally for like first-year seminary students, but it's written in a way that this audience will easily be able to navigate the book. You don't have to know like Hebrew or Greek or anything like that. Nothing special. I think you can get it for like $10 on Amazon, something like that, and it's of course available digitally. So those are just some ways that you can stay connected to me. Again, email those questions to me so that we can kind of integrate those into next week's session. And otherwise, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I am looking forward to next week. Thanks.